Here are the key issues countries will discuss at the COP28 climate summit in Dubai. The biggest task facing COP28 is the global stocktake. That's the name of a process where nearly all countries in the world get together and assess their progress towards tackling climate change. They'll look at what they've already done and what they need to do to get on track to limit global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees, which countries agreed to do under the Paris Agreement. Countries already know they're not on track for either of those goals, so the task facing COP28 is to get together a plan to bring countries towards those targets. One of the toughest issues facing the COP28 talks is the future of fossil fuels, and countries will discuss whether to agree for the first time to phase out the use of coal, oil and gas. Around 80 countries are heading to COP28 asking for a deal on phasing out fossil fuels, including the US, the EU, and climate-vulnerable small island states. However, other countries are opposed. The G20 failed to agree on this issue at a meeting earlier this year, and countries including Russia have publicly said they will oppose a phase-out deal. The issue is particularly prominent at this year's COP because COP28 takes place in the United Arab Emirates, a major oil producer. The head of the climate talks this year, Sultan Al Jaber, is also the head of the country's oil and gas company.
To phase out emissions.
But countries are waiting to see if he will push other oil-rich nations at COP28 to agree to a fossil fuel phase-out. Finance is a major issue at every UN climate summit, and it's particularly high on the agenda at COP28 because there countries will try to launch a new climate damage fund to help vulnerable countries with the costs they're suffering from climate impacts. The EU and the US have both said that they will contribute to this fund at COP28, but how much, we don't yet know. They are also pressuring countries like China and the UAE to also contribute to the fund. Other issues countries will discuss at COP28 include pledges to triple renewable energy this decade and what role carbon capture technologies should play in meeting climate goals.
Each country has its own agenda for the nearly 200 nations gathering at COP28 in Dubai. And finding consensus is a challenge, as UN climate negotiations need unanimous support to pass. Here are some of the climate summit's main players and what they're looking for. China, the world leader in both clean and dirty energy. It's responsible for 30% of annual global emissions, making it the world's biggest greenhouse gas emitter. But it also has more renewable energy capacity than anywhere else. China has been feeling the impacts of climate change through heat waves, floods, and extreme drought. Despite having the world's second largest economy after the US, it sees itself as a developing nation in climate talks and argues wealthy, developed nations like the US should move first and fastest in policy and finance. It's part of the bloc of basic countries alongside South Africa, Brazil, and India, who argue the same. The United States is the world's second largest emitter. It comes to COP28 a year into rolling out a $369 billion plus subsidy package for electric vehicles and other green products. Its Inflation Reduction Act is expected to triple the country's clean energy capacity by 2030. But U.S. delegates will face pressure at COP28 after Washington pledged no new climate cash to the United Nations this year. It supports a COP28 deal to phase out CO2-emitting fossil fuel use, despite being the world's biggest oil and gas producer. The 27-country European Union is among the most ambitious. The bloc, along with the US, is pushing to triple renewable capacity. It also aims to end new coal-fueled power plants, phase out fossil fuels, and power electricity grids with renewable sources in the 2030s. African countries are pushing for climate finance to speed up green energy projects. But not everyone's on the same page. Some, like Kenya, Ethiopia, and Senegal, have backed calls for phasing out fossil fuel production. Others, like Mozambique, want to develop their reserve of gas to capitalize off European gas demands. But they do agree that any deal on phasing out fossil fuels must allow poor nations to develop reserves in the short term to alleviate energy poverty. There's a lot of global climate jargon out there. Here's a rough guide to the acronyms and terms you might hear in Dubai at this year's United Nations Climate Change Conference. Global warming refers to the gradual increase in the average temperature around the world. It's now more than 1.1 degrees Celsius, or 2 degrees Fahrenheit, above the average pre-industrial temperature. Climate change is a broader term, which also wraps in consequences like weather extremes. Greenhouse gases trap heat that warms up the atmosphere. The key greenhouse gases are methane and carbon dioxide. Burning fossil fuels and industrial activities are the main drivers of the world's excess emissions. The UNFCCC, which stands for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, is a treaty to halt climate change. It was adopted in 1994 by nearly 200 countries. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, is the main scientific body under that treaty. Scientists from countries that signed on release reports that lay out the global scientific consensus on climate science. COP stands for Conference of the Parties. It's the yearly meetup of signatories to that 1994 treaty. This year marks the 28th gathering, and it's in Dubai. The acronym CBDR stands for Common but Differentiated Responsibilities. The idea is that wealthy countries should do more to rein in climate change because they were the biggest emitters historically. An NDC is a nationally determined contribution, or what countries plan to do to reduce emissions and adapt to climate impacts. The global stocktake is like a report card on limiting warming. The first one will take place at COP28 in Dubai. Net zero doesn't mean zero emissions. It just means no more than what can be captured by technology, tree planting, or other ways. Most countries aim to achieve net zero by 2050. Carbon offset schemes offer rewards for reducing emissions. Say a company or government invests in a project to restore forests or grow seaweed. That could qualify for carbon credits, which can be sold or used to bring down their own reported emissions.
The most important thing in COP28 is to be clear that the way we are going is not viable, and define a level of ambition that is likely to keep a chance for the world to live with temperatures not exceeding 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. Between 2019 and 2030, we have to shrink emissions somewhere between 25 and 50%, whereas all the commitments would give us a meager 11%. So that is, to my mind, the number one priority for this COP, is to recognize that business as usual has to be dropped